Parents told my brother to take my house because I have no family. My entitled parents want to take my house and give it to my golden child brother, even though they themselves kicked me out of their home, saying there was no room for me. I want to warn you right away that this story will be insanely long. So long that it wouldn't even fit into a single hour. But don't worry, it consists of several parts, 9 in total, and you don't have to listen to it all at once from beginning to end. For convenience, this story was originally divided into parts. Let's begin. Honestly, I don't really care whether you believe this or not. This whole story is complete madness. I don't blame those who call it nonsense. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself. So I won't argue with you. I also don't care if someone from my family sees this. I'm not going to embellish anything, but I also won't reveal details that could expose my identity. For those who don't know me, I am in my early 30s. I am not married. I have a younger brother, Daniel, who is 29 years old, and he already has 4 children. His first child was born when he was 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born just a couple of months ago. I don't get along with his wife, Sarah. She constantly behaves arrogantly and deliberately tries to provoke me. And if I react in any way, she immediately turns into a victim. She can burst into tears on the spot and even put on a full performance just to gain sympathy. My parents and my brother absolutely adore her, even though they know perfectly well what she's really like. They simply don't care. I'll admit it, she is a very beautiful woman. But at the same time, she is so vile that I could never feel any attraction toward her. On top of that, she refuses to work despite having a university degree. My mother, Margaret, gladly helps her with the children all day long, so the financial situation of their large family depends entirely on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere except my parents' house. Personal space is also a huge issue, considering that 4 adults and 4 children live under one roof in a 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. The age difference between us is only 3 years, but he developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished whenever I reacted to his behavior in any way. It was obvious that my parents cared far more about him, because he got everything unless other people started calling my parents out on it. And that happened quite often, especially from other family members. Because of this, we moved about 240 kilometers away from the rest of our relatives. As a result, we usually only saw them on holidays, since the trip took about 3 hours. My brother used physical violence against me several times. He constantly flirted with my first girlfriend, which eventually caused her to break up with me. He laughed at every single one of my failures. My parents always told me to just ignore it whenever I got upset. The only time they treated me equally was when they wanted to keep up appearances. I'll admit, it was pretty amusing to watch their faces when they were forced to treat me the same as my brother during birthdays and Christmas, because other people were around. We had relatives who loved to stick their noses into other people's business and gossip, so my parents tried hard to hide what was really going on in our family. They threatened to take away all my belongings if I ever spoke up. In fact, my parents threw a real celebration when I turned 18 and moved out, because they no longer had to support me. I hadn't even finished school when I left home, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. Since then, I kept contact with them to an absolute minimum. They didn't even come to my graduation ceremony, and I didn't care. After that, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays when other relatives were present. The beginning of the pandemic in 2020 was a difficult time for me. I lost my job and couldn't renew my apartment lease. My roommate also lost his job, and we couldn't afford to stay there on unemployment benefits. It was a 2-bedroom apartment that I had grown very attached to. When the lease was about to end, my roommate left early to move in with relatives. I had to sell almost all my belongings because I was about to become homeless. In truth, I never should have rented such an expensive place. I liked living large until life taught me a lesson. I realized I should have lived somewhere cheaper and saved money for emergencies. But I had a plan. I own a pickup truck, and I bought a camper for $1,000 in good condition and mounted it on my truck so I could live in it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living there much longer than planned. I hoped to stay in the camper on my parents' property, where my brother and his family also lived. But when I asked my parents if I could stay there for a while, they said their house was already full and they didn't want me there. They also said we hadn't gotten along for the past 10 years. They told me they would only agree if I paid them the same amount as renting an apartment in their area. That was an outrageous sum just to park my truck on their property. I was unemployed and trying to save every dollar from my unemployment benefits until I found a new job. For that amount of money, I could have rented an apartment. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't agree on payment. My sister-in-law thought it was hilarious that I was forced to live in a camper. My brother joined in, pointing at me and calling me a homeless bum. The first night, I parked my truck in a store parking lot. I was terrified, thinking someone might try to break in. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Part 2. How my parents tried to take my house for my brother. They broke the locks while I wasn't home. Yes, I understand that there are already similar stories on the internet. I've seen plenty of them. But that doesn't mean someone has a monopoly on events like this happening in real life. Still, I don't blame those who think my story is nonsense. In their place, I would probably think the same. However, by now you should already understand just how messed up my parents are, because they were the source of all the problems in my life and turned my brother into the idiot he is today. Not once did they give me a clear explanation why they treated us differently, and I'm afraid there simply isn't one. Some people just can't explain why they choose a favorite child. All they can do is keep supporting the one they picked. That's exactly what my parents tried to do. In an emotional sense, I practically destroyed their lives by refusing to give in. Not legally, but emotionally. After I kicked my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law out of my house, I immediately went online and made a post telling all our relatives what had happened. I put the conflict out in the open because I knew the first thing my parents would do after getting home was twist the story to make me look like the villain. And I was absolutely right. But I had about an hour to act before they did, and I had video evidence to back up my version of events. My strategy worked, because I immediately received support from some relatives. My parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law probably planned to post their own version, but it was already too late. So they didn't even try to lie much. There were a few relatives who sided with my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law, but not many. Most people already knew how entitled they were, so they understood everything very quickly. There was one person who called me. I don't know who it was, but they were screaming at me at the top of their lungs, saying that I was a horrible brother and that I needed to give way to a real family man. Then they hung up and blocked my number. They never called again. A week passed, and my parents showed up at my door again with my brother, just like they had promised in their ultimatum. They rang the doorbell and pounded on the door like crazy until I finally opened it. I only opened it slightly, and they tried to force their way inside, but I had installed a couple of chains that stopped them. I even pressed my body against the door just to be safe. My father and my brother demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything and that I would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in her sickly sweet voice, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to get the hell away and never come back. My mother immediately burst into fake tears and asked why I couldn't do this for my brother, since he was my beloved little brother. I laughed and said straight to her face that I didn't love him, because he had treated me like garbage for years and they had encouraged it. I told them they were terrible parents and that he was a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave, or I would immediately call the police. They all left surprisingly easily, aside from my mother's loud sobbing and the hateful looks everyone else gave me. Someone might say that it was suspicious how easily they backed off. I thought the whole thing was finally over. I was wrong. I should have taken the situation more seriously, because they had other stupid plans. On Friday evening, when I came home, I saw a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in front of my house. It was my brother, let's call him Daniel, with his family, moving their things in. When he saw me, he simply waved at me with a stupid smile. I was furious and told him and everyone else to stop immediately. But my sister-in-law smugly said that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the fakest voice imaginable, she tilted her head, puffed out her lips, and said that my mommy had given them permission and that I should always listen to my mommy. I was boiling with rage when I heard that and saw the look on her face. So I locked myself in my pickup truck and immediately called the police. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started banging on my window and screaming at me to stop, claiming that I couldn't do this to her and that she and Daniel needed this house. She screamed, "Why can't you just do this for Daniel?" I answered, "Screw him. This is my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to scratch my pickup truck if I didn't stop calling the police. The dispatcher heard everything because my window was slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I would sue her. She was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Daniel and my sister-in-law locked themselves inside my house with the kids. I told the officers what had happened and showed them my driver's license with my current address on it. When we went to the front door, I saw that they had changed the locks. The old lock was lying on the porch with the core drilled out, and next to it was a drill with a full set of bits. Could they be any dumber, leaving the evidence right there? I pointed out the broken lock in the drill and then gave the police a brief summary of all the previous events. The police immediately took control of the situation. They knocked on the door and announced themselves several times, ordering everyone inside to come out. At first, there was no response. Then my sister-in-law shouted from inside that this was their house now and that I was lying. The officers warned them that if they did not open the door voluntarily, it would only make things worse for them. After a few minutes of shouting and arguing from inside, the door finally opened. My brother Daniel came out first, acting offended and confused, as if he had no idea why the police were there. My sister-in-law followed him, holding one of the kids and crying loudly, saying that I was trying to make her children homeless. I showed the police all the documents proving that I was the legal owner of the house. I also showed them the video recordings from earlier incidents, including my parents trying to force their way inside and the confrontation where they demanded that I give my house to my brother. After reviewing everything, the police told Daniel and his wife to remove all their belongings from the house immediately. They explained very clearly that they had no legal right to be there and that breaking and changing the locks was a criminal offense. My sister-in-law started screaming again, saying that this was unfair and that family should help family. She accused me of being heartless and selfish. One of the officers calmly told her that none of that mattered in this situation, because the law was very clear. Then my parents suddenly arrived. I honestly do not know who called them, but the moment I saw their car, my stomach dropped. My mother rushed over, crying and yelling that the police were destroying her family. My father immediately started arguing with the officers, claiming that this was all a misunderstanding and that everything could be solved within the family. The police shut that down very quickly. They warned my parents that if they interfered or caused any more problems, they would be removed as well. My father went quiet after that, but my mother kept sobbing and repeating that I was ruining my brother's life. One of the officers pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to press charges for the broken lock and illegal entry. I said yes, without hesitation. At that point, my brother completely lost it. He started yelling at me, calling me a traitor and saying that I had always been jealous of him. He said that I owed him everything and that my parents had always promised him this house. I told him that promises meant nothing when the house was legally mine, and that if our parents had promised him something that did not belong to them, that was their problem, not mine. The police made Daniel and his wife load their things back into the moving truck and leave. They were not allowed to take anything that belonged to me. My parents left shortly after, still crying and glaring at me like I had committed some unforgivable crime. The officers stayed for a while longer, documented the damage, and gave me instructions on how to proceed with the charges. They also advised me to consider a restraining order if my family continued to harass me. That night, after everything was finally quiet, I sat alone in my house, exhausted and shaking. I realized that this situation was far from over, but at least for now, my home was still mine. For the next few days, everything was strangely quiet. No calls, no messages, no surprise visits. It felt unnatural, almost like the calm before a storm. I knew my parents well enough to understand that they would not just give up. They never did. Silence from them usually meant they were planning something. I changed the locks again, installed a security system, and added cameras covering every entrance. I also informed my neighbors about the situation and asked them to call the police immediately if they saw my parents or my brother near the house. Everyone was supportive and said they would keep an eye out. A few days later, I received a long message from my mother. She wrote about how hurt she was, how I had embarrassed the family, and how everyone was talking about us now. She said that I was selfish and cruel for choosing a house over my own brother. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she admit that they had done anything wrong. She ended the message by saying that my brother was depressed, that his marriage was suffering, and that all of it was my fault. I did not reply. The next message came from my father. It was much shorter. He said that if I had any conscience left, I would sit down like an adult and resolve this peacefully. He added that involving the police was a betrayal and that I would regret it one day. I did not reply to him either. Then the threats started. At first, they were subtle. My brother sent me messages saying that accidents happen, that houses can burn down, and that it would be a shame if something happened while I was at work. I saved everything and sent the screenshots directly to the police. After that, the messages stopped. About a week later, I was officially contacted by the authorities regarding the charges. My brother and his wife were being investigated for illegal entry, destruction of property, and harassment. My parents were also warned to stay away from me and my property. That was the moment when reality finally hit them. My mother called me again, this time screaming. She said that I was trying to put my own brother in jail, that I was a monster, and that she wished she had never given birth to me. She told me that I was dead to her. I calmly told her that she had made her choice years ago, and that this was simply the result of it. Then I blocked her number. I blocked my father. I blocked my brother. I blocked my sister-in-law. I cut off every single one of them. For the first time in my life, I felt free. It hurt. I am not going to lie. Losing your entire family, even a toxic one, is not easy. But the constant fear, pressure, and manipulation were gone. My home finally felt safe. I do not know what will happen in the future. Maybe they will try again. Maybe they will disappear from my life forever. But one thing is certain, I will never give them my house, my peace, or my sanity. A few weeks passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new routine. The court process was moving forward, and I was regularly contacted for updates and additional statements. I provided everything they asked for, screenshots, videos, messages, and records of every incident. The authorities took the situation seriously, especially the threats my brother had sent. My parents tried one last tactic. One afternoon, I received a message from a distant relative, someone I barely spoke to. They said my mother was very sick and that she wanted to see me, claiming it might be the last chance for reconciliation. The message was full of guilt and pressure, telling me that no house was worth destroying a family over. I did not go. Later, I found out through another relative that my mother was not sick at all. It was just another attempt to manipulate me into meeting them in person. That was the moment I knew I had made the right decision by cutting them off completely. The legal consequences came faster than I expected. My brother and his wife were fined for the illegal lock change and property damage. They were also officially warned that any further contact with me would result in more serious charges. The restraining order was approved shortly after. My parents were furious. They sent messages through other people, calling me cold, ungrateful, and cruel. Some relatives stopped talking to me entirely. Others quietly admitted that they understood why I did what I did, but did not want to get involved. I accepted that. I had already lost my family once. Losing a few relatives did not scare me anymore. What surprised me the most was how peaceful my life became. No constant phone calls. No surprise visits. No emotional blackmail. I could come home from work and actually relax. I slept better than I ever had before. Sometimes I still think about my brother and wonder how he ended up like this. But then I remember that he was shaped by our parents, excused at every step, and taught that he was entitled to everything. That is not my burden to carry. I am done sacrificing myself for people who never cared about me. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that being related by blood does not mean someone deserves unlimited access to your life. Boundaries are not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. This house is my home. And for the first time, it truly feels like it. A few months later, I thought the situation was finally behind me. The restraining order was active, the legal issues had been resolved, and there had been no attempts to contact me directly. I allowed myself to believe that my parents and my brother had accepted reality. That belief did not last long. One evening, I received a notification from my security system. Someone was near my house. When I checked the camera feed, I saw my parents standing by the gate. My mother was crying dramatically, and my father was pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. They did not try to enter the property, but they stayed there for a long time. I did not go outside. Instead, I called the police and informed them that people who were under a restraining order were on my property. By the time the officers arrived, my parents were still there, arguing with each other and blaming me for everything that had happened. The police reminded them of the restraining order and warned them that this was their final warning. If they showed up again, there would be serious consequences. My mother collapsed into hysterical crying, claiming she was just a desperate mother who wanted to talk to her son. The officers were not moved. After that incident, something changed. My parents stopped trying to reach me directly, but I started hearing things through other people. Apparently, my brother had lost his job. His marriage was falling apart. They were struggling financially. And, according to my parents, all of it was somehow my fault. I felt no guilt. For years, I had been taught to put everyone else first, to sacrifice myself for family. Now I finally understood how deeply that mindset had damaged me. Walking away was not selfish. It was survival. I focused on my own life. I worked, saved money, improved my house, and built routines that made me feel stable. I started enjoying simple things, quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, and the feeling of being safe in my own space. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it. The honest answer is no. I regret the childhood I never had. I regret believing for so long that love meant enduring abuse. But I do not regret standing my ground. If my parents ever read this, I hope they understand one thing: they did not lose a son because of a house. They lost him because they chose favoritism, manipulation, and control over respect and fairness. And I finally chose myself. Almost a year has passed since everything happened. Life has stabilized in a way I never thought was possible. The chaos, the constant anxiety, the feeling that something bad was always about to happen, all of that is gone. The restraining order was eventually extended. My parents tried to appeal it, claiming they were being unfairly punished for loving their children. The request was denied. The court made it very clear that love does not include harassment, threats, or attempts to steal property. My brother disappeared from my life completely. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his wife finally left him and took the kids. Apparently, living without my parents constantly cleaning up his messes exposed just how incapable he really was. Again, none of that was my responsibility. There were moments when loneliness hit hard. Holidays were the worst. No family dinners, no forced smiles, no pretending everything was fine. But even then, the silence felt healthier than the lies I used to live with. I started building my own version of family instead. Friends became closer. Neighbors became familiar faces. I learned that support does not have to come from blood, and respect should never be conditional. People who truly care do not try to control you. Sometimes I still get messages from distant relatives asking if I will ever forgive my parents. My answer is always the same: forgiveness does not require allowing someone back into your life. I can move on without reopening old wounds. This story is not about a house. The house was just the excuse. This is a story about years of favoritism, manipulation, and emotional abuse finally reaching a breaking point. It is about choosing self-respect over guilt and peace over obligation. If you are reading this and recognize yourself in my situation, know this: you are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting what is yours. And you are not wrong for walking away when staying would destroy you. I lost my family. But I gained my life. How Dan found out the truth about his wife. To be clear, most of this information came from Dan and my parents. I am simply retelling it. When Dan suddenly accused his wife of cheating in March, it shocked all of us, because we thought he was completely under her thumb. But it turned out that this was not the case. You all know how he treated me when I stood up against him. Well, his wife did not have it any easier either. He started putting together the pieces of the puzzle about her betrayal after he finally pulled his head out of the sand and secretly ran DNA tests on all of his children. 3 of the children turned out to be his, but the youngest child was not. For context, Dan and I both have almost black, straight hair, just like our parents. His wife also has straight, dark hair. But the baby had light-colored and slightly curly hair. At first, Dan thought the child's hair would darken with age, but it never did. I think that was the biggest red flag for Dan. He confronted his wife with the DNA test results in front of our parents. She immediately burst into tears, claiming that the results were a lab error. She used all the classic tactics: denial, gradual admission of the truth, and manipulation. But Dan did not fall for it. He went much further to uncover the truth about her affair than I ever thought he would. I always knew he was smart, he had just allowed himself to be stupid. He had detailed evidence of her cheating, phone call logs, messages he read on her phone, bank statements, and the DNA test. He even identified her lover, who was most likely the biological father of the baby, since he also had light and curly hair. The evidence against her was ironclad. Dan said that she hid her affair so poorly that it was not difficult for him to figure everything out. My parents demanded that she immediately leave their house. That was when she completely lost control. At first, she just screamed, but she quickly became aggressive. My mother had to call the police. Yes, my wife's ex, the daughter-in-law, was arrested. She scratched Dan and my father with her long acrylic nails, and even her eldest son got caught in the chaos when he tried to intervene. Dan was smart enough to record everything on his phone, so the police had all they needed to arrest her for assault. Her parents had to come and get her out of jail. After that, they returned to collect the baby, her belongings, and her car a couple of days later. Shortly after she was released, she appeared at my house, apparently thinking I was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she started a rambling tirade, accusing me of posting everything online. She then declared that I was her worst enemy. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been under the influence of something because she seemed even crazier than usual, and her eyes looked unnatural. She claimed that mothers with young children were the most sacred thing in the world. Then she screamed that giving up her home wasn't a big deal because supporting the family was the least I could do. And if I did that, her family would be together. When I tried to respond, she tried to push me and cover my mouth with her hand. She even raised her hand as if ready to scratch me. As you can guess, it did not end in her favor. I am not the type to be intimidated. I told her I would call the police if she didn't immediately remove her hands from me. I also told her that everything was being recorded on my doorbell camera. She panicked as soon as she heard the word camera. Then I verbally humiliated her so much that she began to back away. I told her she had the audacity to call me selfish when she herself was selfish. She didn't work anywhere, cheated on her husband, got pregnant by her lover, forced my mother to take care of her children, spent Dan's money until they were financially ruined, and acted as if my house belonged to her. I called her a level 100 selfish narcissist and told her to stop blaming me for her own actions and to never appear at my home again. Those words were the last straw. She jumped into her car, hit the gas, and drove off. That was the final straw for me. Now that she was gone from Dan's life, I finally went to the police and filed a report for stalking and assault she had committed against me the previous year, as well as her recent actions at my doorstep. I also provided copies of the video to Dan for his divorce lawyer. Yes, I filed for a restraining order against her. It was easily granted because it was obvious this woman was unhinged. Since then, she hasn't posted anything about me, at least not that I've seen. In any case, she left me alone. The daughter-in-law was still in a relationship with her lover during the divorce. At that time, I didn't know what kind of person he was, but anyone having an affair with a married woman and fathering her child probably had no moral principles. When the divorce began, the daughter-in-law admitted that Dan was no longer a real man for her because he couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. She truly considered herself a trophy wife and believed she deserved someone wealthy. Dan said he laughed maniacally in her face and told her that she wasn't even close to being attractive enough to be a trophy wife. He also pointed out her other flaws. Once again, she was humiliated by having to live with her parents. She had to work in their family business because Dan no longer gave her access to his bank accounts. This woman had already maxed out all the credit cards he had previously given her. She complained about having to work for her parents, but I think they were the only ones willing to hire her, given her criminal record and a decade-long career gap. I heard from Dan that her parents were very disappointed in her. In any case, this awful divorce really added fuel to the fire. She didn't get much from Dan because she physically cheated, harmed her father-in-law, husband, and eldest child, and the divorce process was largely her fault. So she said goodbye to any chance of getting what she wanted. Part 7: What I know about my brother Dan's divorce. Dan's lawyer tried to speed up the divorce process, but it cost my brother a lot. I don't know the exact amount. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, ended up in a dire financial situation. And you know what happens when you corner an animal. She started resisting, but the law was not on her side. As her finances dwindled, her parents had to pay for her lawyer, but he turned out not to be very good. Moreover, she brought her lover to the divorce court to act as her defense. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile and tried to use it in his favor. He claimed the daughter-in-law suffered from an incapable husband, so she sought comfort in another man's arms. He said he was willing to take responsibility for the child he fathered. He also claimed the daughter-in-law would need alimony to support herself and the child. He noted that since Dan's name was still on the birth certificate at that time, alimony was technically his responsibility. Dan said this guy used sweet words and charm, but he was stupid. The judge wasn't fooled either and called him a hypocrite for claiming he'd take responsibility for his child while asking money from the man whose marriage he had destroyed. Dan was prepared to sue his wife's lover for intentional interference with marriage, which exists in some US states, but he didn't. Apparently, Dan would have had to prove she loved him before the affair started. After seeing her true nature, we weren't even sure she ever loved him or was just using him for income. Many commentators suggested the daughter-in-law might have had children just to avoid working, and they might be right. She tried to drag out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge wouldn't allow it. All the evidence we had made her attempts to play the victim useless, so she just gave in to her true nature, as there was no point in hiding it anymore. At court, there were all the records provided by Dan and me, police reports, photos, and videos proving she was cruel and narcissistic. At the end of the divorce, the daughter-in-law struck a deal. Dan took care of the credit card debts, removed his name from the birth certificate of the child, and the daughter-in-law received partial custody of the children without alimony and without most of the credit card debt she had accumulated. Her official employment with her parents meant she had her own income to start paying off her debts. She could see the children almost any time and even take them on weekends. For some reason, though, she very rarely tried to see them. A few times, she took them to eat at a fast food restaurant, but never for overnight stays. You might think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they didn't contact Dan about it. They rarely visited Dan's children before the divorce and now may never see them at all. As for Dan, he truly loved his wife, so her infidelity hit him hard. On the night he confronted her about the affair, he came to me staggering with a bottle of whiskey in hand and scratched. I was scared to see him in that state and started scolding him for drunk driving, but it meant little to him compared to the betrayal of his cheating wife. We spent several hours in my camper so as not to disturb the renters. During that time, Dan drank whiskey straight from the bottle and cried, saying he was an idiot and regretted marrying that woman. Almost every time he now mentions her, he calls her simply that woman, which has become the nickname for my ex-daughter-in-law. Ironically, those few hours together were the closest I had been to Dan in the last 15 years. Although he didn't directly apologize, he called himself a disgusting person with terrible taste in women, and said that at least I hadn't made his mistakes. Despite everything he had done to me in the past, he was still my younger brother. I couldn't risk letting him drive, so I told him to stay the night and took his car keys. I prepared a sleeping place for him in my camper, as all other rooms were occupied. He wasn't in a condition to go home, and taking a taxi would have been expensive, plus he'd have to come back for his car. He was still depressed and crying and didn't want our parents or his children to see him in that state. Honestly, I feared he might do something extremely stupid if I let him leave. About a month after he split from his wife, Dan came to ask to borrow my camper. Apparently, he found it more convenient to sleep in it than I thought. He said that after his wife left, he gave his room to his eldest child. He has 2 daughters and a son. The children had previously had to share one room. For the boy, they just hung curtains on his side, but he often slept on the couch to avoid being around his sisters. I knew the poor boy really wanted his own room, so Dan decided to be a good father and asked to borrow the camper so his son could have it. If he could afford it, he would have bought his own camper. I eventually agreed and let him use it for the greater good. No, I didn't charge rent. Dan was already in a tough situation financially, and his ex-wife and the divorce had hit him hard. I understood that lately, I was making progress in my relationship with my family by not holding grudges. I personally delivered the camper and set it up in the backyard of our parents. My father installed a 30A automatic breaker so Dan had enough power for heating and air conditioning. I miss my camper. After so many years living in it, it felt like a part of me. But the only reason I lent it was for the kids. They're practically the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan. It's for those children because I'm attached to them. Yes, I know I might not get the camper back soon and probably not in the same condition I gave it, but I warned Dan and my parents that they would be financially responsible for any damage and for maintaining it while he used it. I also took many photos and videos of the camper inside and out before lending it. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my conditions. So we had something like a formal agreement. Due to divorce expenses, Dan probably won't be able to get his own housing for several years. He seems not to complain about life in general, but I don't know if he actually likes this lifestyle or just pretends. I received a lot of gratitude from relatives for letting my brother use the camper. Many now call me a good brother, which Dan doesn't deserve. In any case, I think getting rid of the daughter-in-law was an excellent first step toward restoring our family. I still don't care much about my brother or parents after they mistreated me all my life, but I won't let Dan's children suffer because of it. These kids are really attached to me. They actually get excited when I come to them or when they come to me. I've even babysat them a few times. Now that their mother isn't around, they become much kinder, especially to me. I'm finally starting to enjoy being an uncle. My father often looks very depressed in my presence, but otherwise, he either stays silent or behaves normally toward me. He doesn't talk to me much, though our relationship has improved compared to before. I'm not going to lower my guard. My parents are happy that my ex-daughter-in-law left their house and often say they don't understand what they ever saw in her, especially my mother, who spent a long time arguing over who was the main lady of the house. At the same time, during the divorce, Dan filed to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the child who wasn't his. The daughter-in-law actually didn't want this because it would mean no alimony from Dan. However, by court order, the lover took a paternity test. I would have laughed for a long time if it turned out he wasn't the father either. But he was. Dan's lawyer had long talks with the ex-daughter-in-law's lawyer. She had no chance to contest it, and Dan was ready to make her situation even worse. The daughter-in-law had no financial means to fight him in court, so she agreed to amend the birth certificate. The man who fathered the child took full financial responsibility for the child. Later, he contacted Dan through his lawyer and told him that he had broken up with the daughter-in-law and wouldn't bother him again. I checked this guy's social media after Dan sent me a link. He was upset that he now had financial responsibility for a child he never planned to have and that he was too young for it. By the way, according to Dan's lawyer, this guy was just over 40, but looked younger. Possibly, this is the end. The ex-daughter-in-law left our lives. My parents and brother finally tried to become better people. I'm surprisingly happy to be an uncle, and my home still remains mine. Part 9, my pickup truck got egged on Halloween. This happened late at night or early in the morning on November 1st. I suspect it was my ex-daughter-in-law, but the person caught on my cameras was wearing several layers of thick clothing, large glasses covering their eyes, and a scarf wrapped around the lower half of their face. It was impossible to even tell whether it was a man or a woman. This person also came on foot, so the car couldn't be identified. They were about the same height as my ex-daughter-in-law, but that alone isn't enough to consider it proof. If it was her, she knew about my cameras, so covering her face and body for this minor egg-based mischief was probably the smartest thing she had done in years, a perfect way to finally apply her higher education in practice. The person with the eggs appeared around 3 a.m. I was fast asleep and didn't hear anything. They quickly threw a dozen eggs at my pickup truck. At least they didn't try to cause serious damage and vanished quickly after tossing the last egg. I didn't notice anything until I went out to leave for work in the morning. During my lunch break, I took the pickup to a local car wash. Most of the eggs were washed off. Eggs are actually harmful to paint, but my 1990s pickup already doesn't look brand new. I took photos of the pickup and filed a police report, including the surveillance footage as evidence. But so far, it hasn't led to anything. No real damage was done aside from my annoyance and the $15 I spent at the car wash. If it was my ex-daughter-in-law, she was smart enough to throw eggs rather than scratch the paint or puncture the tires. I don't think anything will come of the police report, as the cops seem to have dismissed it as a kid's prank. I understand they're probably overwhelmed with real work. At least I filed a report in case of future incidents. I waited some time to write this post because I thought maybe something else would happen, but no, everything has been calm. I'd appreciate any good advice in case something like this happens again. What do you think about this whole story? Be sure to comment if you think the author went too far with all the revenge, or if maybe he's being too sensitive about everything happening to him, or if perhaps his revenge wasn't strong enough. I'm curious to hear your opinions. Anyway, thank you for watching this video until the end. Be sure to subscribe to the channel.